Okay, so let's start. Hello, folks out there. I don't see anyone, but I assume that there must be at least some audience out there. Let me begin by saying, first of all, this is going to be a really interesting discussion, I think, and it's titled Space Aliens to Time Travel, Interdisciplinary Archaeological Perspectives, and welcome to Portland, Oregon. The Professor Pedro Furbo Azcarate from the Black Studies Department at Portland State University will be, of course, our guest speaker for this, the seventh conversation in anthropology, sponsored by Vilnius University and the Society for Anthropological Sciences. It's a lot of S's in a row, especially since I've been drinking a lot of coffee. Okay, so let me begin with just a brief introduction. And well, this is a longer introduction than I normally have because Pedro is a close friend of mine, and Portland is a city that I've always had like an American dream about within America. So usually my introductions reflect on academic accomplishments of the speaker, and I will get to some of those right now. Pedro, as I call him, is an archaeologist because that's his name and I'm familiar enough to call him Pedro. So Pedro is an archaeologist who received his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He has written on how Columbus's log of 1493 misidentified cannibalism for ancestor worship and provided strong forensic evidence for his argument. Beyond just setting the archaeological record straight that the Carib people, the indigenous people of the Caribbean, were not cannibals, but rather ancestor worship their ancestors, he also took this a step further and argued that Disney, this is a quote, Disney should retract their portrayal of indigenous Caribbeans as cannibals and savages and should offer a formal apology to Chief Charles Williams and the Carib people of Dominica. The real adventure story is about the survival of indigenous people of Dominica, the Caribbean people, and it's a story that's rarely told. After 500 years of resistance, the native Carib, the Kalinago and Taino, have survived to the present day. End of quote. Pedro has been active in the creation also of land acknowledgements in Portland and the Caribbean. A land acknowledgement, which I'm a little bit ashamed to say, but I'd never heard of this before, so I found it quite interesting. A land acknowledgement refers to remembering the history of the land which we are now living on and using for our own interests. Pedro explained land acknowledgements as a means for people to, quote, increase their common awareness and appreciation for the indigeneity of the place on which they are standing, thus giving history to that place and creating connections between the past and present residents of the land. I think this is a really interesting counterpoint to the cancel culture argument of the right, since Pedro is making an argument that there's, as I understand it, layers of cultures and people that once inhabited this land, and we should pay special attention to the indigenous people who came before us when we're reusing this land and living on it. So rather than cancel culture, he's arguing we should add more layers of culture and not just focus on the present culture on that land. It's a good argument, I think, and that one I hadn't thought of much before. Okay, I would like to add another small personal touch to this introduction. Pedro was a student of mine in 1990 when I got my first gig as a full-time assistant professor at the University University of South Carolina at Columbia. And we became close friends, as was Marcus and Kathleen, who I think may be in the audience. If you are, please let us know. Pedro has a whimsical, Harpo-like attitude about life that I have always enjoyed. We managed to stay in communication between 1990 and now with sporadic emails. However, in 2019, the Society for Applied Anthropology had a conference in Portland, and I went with my family there, and Pedro and I reconnected, and he showed me around town. In 2019, Portland was a city renowned for being wacky and populated by aging hippies from California, as well as old timers who were mostly right of center survivalists. So was the stereotype, at least I had in my head. My wife and I and our children, we rode bikes through the city, and in general, it seemed to be an amazingly liberal city with an infrastructure that made it seem easy to get from home to work and back. It seemed different than the New York City where I lived nearby at that time. Pedro showed us the Adobe-style home he had built. He and his wife and another woman also had launched a successful business producing nixtamalized masa and tortillas from organic corn from independent Mexican farmers. The nixtamalized corn is really interesting. I saw a video on it. You can go to YouTube and see a few videos on this, but it's a way of getting the nutrients out of the corn that if it isn't nixtamalized, you don't otherwise digest or get. So it all seemed very neat. I talked enthusiastically with my wife and kids about moving to Portland. Instead, we moved to Vilnius, a city which is at least as rainy as Portland is. In an email from Pedro during the early stages of the pandemic, Pedro wrote about how things have changed in seemingly fundamental ways in Portland. The dream of an urban utopia had turned into something approaching an urban dystopia, with a mix of peaceful demonstrators, Antifa, Proud Boys, and police that seemed to side mostly with the Proud Boys. And all this mixture eventuated in violent counter demonstrations to what were initially, for the most part, peaceful, larger demonstrations. The unrest seemed to be woven into the tapestry of daily life in Portland. I look at The Guardian online, and if you look at The Guardian, type in Portland, there must be an article once a month on demonstrations and political activists' activities in Portland. Hopefully Pedro can be our guide to understanding what's going on in Portland and the underlying history and contemporary conditions fueling this chronic unrest that seems to be, well, not never ending, but not ending in the near future. So Pedro, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Victor. Really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to assume that the folks in this room and perhaps the folks listening after this is archived are predominantly anthropologists. This is a conversation in anthropology. So I also just want to welcome everyone who is, I think, mostly in Vilnius, but I see that a friend of mine in Portland, who I'm going to actually refer to some of his work. We've done work together in community organizations on urban placemaking. So just want to say hi to Mark, who's joined us. I can see who is in the room. I don't know why you can't, but let me also say, Victor, it's thanks for inviting me and just like hanging out and having a conversation. Mm-hmm. I had great experiences. Like this is now 30 years ago that we were mm-hmm. together in the University of South Carolina. I was a master's student in anthropology. And here's Victor DeMonk, a junior faculty member, and very impressive in his scope of knowledge. And I think the thing that I always appreciated about Victor is his curiosity. He brings, like, I think this is anthropology, but this is also just Victor. As a human being, he's curious to understand things. And he does that in a accountable way. So he has like this rigorous methodology that he just brings along with him. And he doesn't let that get in the way of his curiosity. He has a very open-minded approach, I think, to life. And I really miss him. It was great to see him like 2 years ago in Portland, and it's great to see you here today. And I think another part, we're not talking about collective memory, but it is something that interests me as an anthropologist. And we share different memories from our times in South Carolina. And it's really important to be in community because as individuals, we kind of remember just certain components of our collective experience. So when we separate from each other, we lose the richness of those memories. So that's something that's, it's interesting anthropologically, but then also just personally, it's a part of the life that I had and part of life that Victor had. And we really need each other to remember and to give value to those experiences. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but it's just a pleasure to be here. I'll share my screen. I am interested, I think we're mostly Lithuanian or folks from all over the place potentially. And I do like the idea of a conversation. If you do have a question, you can like raise your hand, and I'm going to kind of show a lot of images and try to be entertaining by keeping those images moving. But I do want to engage in conversation, and certainly at the end, but also if in the middle of my presentation something comes out and you want to put it in the chat or you just want to raise your hand, I'll trust Victor to kind of moderate that. I'm a teaching faculty at Portland State, so I think this is as much a conversation about pedagogy as it is about, say, anthropological theory. And I am going to focus on Portland, Oregon. And as Victor mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary archaeologist with a focus on the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And that's where most of the work I've done academically. But I'm also somebody who's been living and paying attention in Portland, Oregon for over 25 years. And I wouldn't consider this like an autoethnographic approach. I am going to share anecdotally experiences and an understanding with an attention to the history of this place that I call home. And I hope that approach will be entertaining and edifying. So let me share screen. Okay. So I'm calling this presentation Space Aliens and Time Travel. And these are kind of catchy terms that I will define shortly. And I just wanted to show you Portland. That's part of my goal here, is to give you an informed perspective on Portland, Oregon, and to point out that it is just my own personal perspective. The kind of accountability to interpretation is something that I think is very important, especially in a place like Portland, where I don't consider myself indigenous or native to that place. So I've had to really pay attention to like where this place came from and how it came to be the place that you see in this image. This is 2 years ago, right before the pandemic hit. And it was a beautiful January morning. And I got some other pictures of this. It was a spectacular sunrise that a lot of people noticed and took pictures of. And I think that's like one characteristic. If you look at Portland, we are situated at the confluence of two rivers, between two mountain systems, so in a valley. And there's something spectacular about living in this place that we call home. It has certain features of a city and other features that I'm going to refer to as features of a place. And I'm thinking ecologically, geographically, and also question the confluence of those two ideas of being a city through westernized eyes, and then also considering place from a more indigenous perspective. But people love it. Victor mentioned, it's always some newspaper article or some attention paid to Portland. It's a place where people come and contemplate. You may notice there's no central Eiffel Tower or Space Needle. We don't have monorails. We don't have a lot of the features of a city that would make it iconic. Not exactly sure in Vilnius what those icons would be, but I know you've got castles out there, things that would make the postcards. Portland is not really known for particular iconic features, but more for maybe like a whole broader holistic understanding of place. This is a view from the top of Mount Tabor. We have this fortunate ability to enjoy nature while still being denizens of a city. And we have some public parks that are significant, that have flora, fauna, old growth forests. And then we can go in an hour in each direction and end up on the coast or in the Cascade Mountain Range, the Pacific Coast Range. And these are significant old growth forests that you can still encounter only like an hour or two from our doorsteps. So I think these are ways the environment are certainly influencing us. But Portland is really known as a quirky place, a place of donuts, a place where young people go to retire. This is on the Burnside Bridge. So as a city that's on the Willamette River, we have multiple bridges, multiple places to play. And I think that's something that Portlanders value. Their concepts of livability, and these have been studied by not necessarily anthropologists, but one famous analysis by Robert Putnam, a book called Bowling Alone, pointed out that civic engagement has gone down in the United States since the 1950s, except there are a few anomalies like Portland, Oregon. So in Portland, you'll find a lot of the behavior, I think one that you'll find similar in Vilnius and European cities, where there's a lively urban interaction. There are cafes, there's a cafe culture, bar culture, music culture. And the sizing, we are known as a city of neighborhoods. So I think that's, and even the newer neighborhoods, this is called the Pearl District, a newer neighborhood even looks a little bit like an older neighborhood. So we're scaling things in a way that encourages more pedestrian activity in a way that other urban cities are doing sprawl, and we see more of a suburban engagement. Now, that's not to say that isn't happening in Portland as well, but we're certainly known as this quirky city. There's even a popular TV series that came out called Portlandia that satirizes this quirkiness of Portland. So you know when you're being satirized, like there's somebody, we're being recognized for these human qualities. Now, this isn't to say, like, Portland is the major city in the state of Oregon, highest population, and there is certainly wealth disparities. And I will talk more about where those wealth disparities originated. Since the pandemic, our homeless population has increased. People who don't have safety nets have found themselves having to get by however they can. And the city has taken a more lenient approach than other cities. And we have thousands of homeless folks on our city streets and public spaces. And it's a problem that I think Portland recognizes and is trying to do something about, but also understands that it's a deeply rooted problem, wealth inequities. Crime as well. There are challenges. Any urban center has these kinds of challenges, and Portland is not immune to that in spite of its popularity as this place for young people. It also has an identity for protest. So mentioning Antifa, which really is a number of different anti-fascist groups. A lot of people take it to a political extreme, but for many people, this is a way to socialize. It's a political statement to identify with an ideology, but then you find yourself in community with like-minded people. And I think that's what happens, whether it's Proud Boys, far-right organizations, or Antifa. There is like this element of community building that's happening, and it's not simply a reaction against fascism, although that is the concept. So here's where Portland is located. On the left coast of the United States. And let me start defining some terms for you that I'm using today. Sorry, I just have to move this screen. It doesn't seem to want to move. Okay, I'll see if I can make sense of it. So space aliens, I'm not talking about people from outside of our Earth. These are not alien life forms from Mars. When I use this term, I'm speaking of communities of people who travel uninvited to a bioregion of others. Let me see if I can move this. Really challenged here. Fortunately, I can't. Let me ask Victor. Victor, would you do me the favor of reading this slide?
The space alien slide?
Yes, please.
It says communities of people who travel uninvited to a bioregion of other communities of people with a pathological mindset not to respect either the people of the invaded community nor the bioregion itself. And the progeny of such communities, unaware of where they came from, believing a narrative that disassociates themselves from the violence and trauma they inherited, and that they may perpetuate. That's all I can see.
That's great, thank you. So that's a concept I have for speaking about people who may have immigrated to different regions without respecting the impact of their arrival in those places. And then the concept that I want to introduce of time travel. Victor, could you read that for me?
Sure. To conceive of times in the past, present, and future, and engage in a multifocal, multidimensional, imaginable perspective, grounded in place, accountable to the limitations of analysis, yet open to the possibilities of experiential being, relational thinking, and energetic interconnection in space and time.
Thank you. So these terms I've kind of gathered along my journey as an anthropologist. And Victor mentioned that I have a degree in a program that no longer exists that's called Interdisciplinary Archaeological Studies at the University of Minnesota. It's now been subsumed into the anthropology department. But in this program, students were allowed to use multiple disciplines with an archaeological focus to ask, well, it's a lot of applied questions. I think most of the students working in this program would not only study things like iron smelting in, pre-colonial Ghana, they would then build the iron smelter and do studies of how people in the past would use these iron smelters to make implements. There's this connection between the present and the past that was encouraged in this interdisciplinary archaeological studies program I was in. So I found myself in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, and from what I had read, the indigenous Taino people had been declared extinct really in the 16th century by a Spanish chronicler, the defender of the Indians named Padre Las Casas. And from that time on, it was sort of an accepted reality that there were no longer any indigenous people in the Caribbean. Now, this narrative fit really well with Spanish colonization, and I'll explain that in a sec. But so when I got to the Dominican Republic and I started living there and paying attention to the culture of Dominican people, even though the narrative that I was being told is that they're more Spanish than anything else, I was finding a lot of indigenous cultural survival in their daily lives. And it turns out that the more you dig, the deeper you go into the campo, the more you'll find people practicing indigenous lifestyles and then even identifying as Taino, which is the indigenous name for the people of the Dominican Republic. So my work was time traveling between the past to understand some disjuncture with colonization, and then into the present day to understand how culture has survived. And in this case, there's a resurgence of Taino identity. This is the time of the quincentennial. Remember Columbus, 500 years, 1992. And as I was studying this, there were a number of museum exhibitions and books. And I don't know, Victor, if you remember this, the first encounters, I think you may have left South Carolina, but South Carolina received one of these well-funded museum exhibitions. I think it was called First Encounters, came with a glossy book full of writings by historians and anthropologists, and a replica of Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria. When it went through St. Paul, Minnesota, Vernon Bellecourt of the American Indian Movement took a pint of his blood and threw it on the sails of the Santa Maria on opening night. And there's a great political protest. And that got me thinking about how people are contesting history and spaces of the past and commemoration. And a lot of this is done through narratives, historical narratives, as well as in public art, statuary, museum exhibits. So I was looking at these kinds of concepts. So I've been thinking a lot about how people commemorate place, and I bring that to my study in Portland. I want to introduce you to a couple other concepts. Time travel and Tamanwit. I can just run through this. I think I can read most of it. So I ended up not in an anthropology department, but as core faculty teaching classes in the Black Studies department at Portland State University. And I focus mostly on the Caribbean and Black Latin America. So Black Studies is a field, it's also interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And we're looking at the Black experience in Africa, African America, the United States, and really throughout the Americas and the world. So my area is really the Caribbean, but you can't help being seasoned. Like I've been there about 20 years, and I've really been inspired by a lot of the work on Afrofuturism, which is a whole area. We could talk about that if anyone is interested. But this concept of time travel can be seen in works of speculative fiction, in critical analyses of history, in studies of spiritism. Some of the luminaries, and I'll just mention Bell Hooks died yesterday, incredible Black feminist scholar who totally impacted my worldview. Octavia Butler, who's a science fiction writer, Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a Black studies scholar and taught me a deeper understanding of white supremacy as a sociopathy, which I'll share with you in a sec. And my colleagues, Taria Autry, Walida Marisha, Juan Gonzalez Perez in Cuba, Victor Gomez in Dominican Republic, Daryl Milner, who's also in our Black Studies department and is a foremost scholar on York from the Lewis and Clark expedition, which I will explain in a sec, and my colleague Ridwan Naitakodeen. Indigenous nation studies also has seasoned my understanding of place and time travel. Scholars, colleagues, Cornell Piwiwardi, Judy Bluehorse, Grace Dillon, and Jorge Estevez and the Taino Resurgence movement have taught me to think beyond my box of analysis. The space aliens concept, literally that term, I co-conceived with Mark Lakeman of the City Repair Project, who I believe is still in the room with us. And I've worked with Mark on projects of permaculture and urban placemaking in Portland, Oregon. And I can send you off to some of the work that he does as an architect and designer of place. All of that has really influenced me because it's not just me. Like, as I said in the beginning with our collective memories, like really if I have anything important to say, if there's any knowledge I'm sharing, it's only because I have shared with others. I've learned in communities with other people. There are a couple terms here that I want to introduce that are really useful. Tamanwit, or a natural law philosophy, which comes from the Columbia River. It's believed to be a Yakama term, if I understand. And the term Biskabiang, which is a return to indigenous thinking, which is Anishinaabe. These are philosophical concepts of indigeneity related to place. And I don't speak either of these languages, but I'll point out that we do not have these kinds of terms. Maybe permaculture is the closest term that we use related to Tamanwit and Biskabayang. But Tamanwit, I think, to me, it's a great way of encapsulating a pre-colonial philosophy of place. And Biskabayang is kind of the praxis. It is the application of Tamanwit to particular situations. So you may have recognized I've got some critical thinking going on around Western philosophy, and there are colonial assumptions that I think I certainly bring, and I think we all bring, to these ideas of interpretation, to basic how we understand cultures and communities of people. And I know in anthropology there's a lot of self-reflection. I don't really have my finger on the pulse of the latest work in this area, but I would question any anthropological analysis that doesn't ground where the interpreter is situated. I was very turned on by Donna Haraway's situated knowledge way back when I was with Victor at the University of South Carolina with our colleague Joan Giro. Introduced me to feminist thinking that suggests, and this was from like a kind of an anti-patriarchal perspective, that we make assumptions in our analysis that are not grounded in these very important orienting philosophies. So for anybody who's colonized, this is like a United States American perspective. Within our interpretation, we assume concepts of individualism, materialism, competition, and a Eurocentric positionality. That's sort of our baseline where we begin our analysis, and those ideas aren't usually questioned. So I'll give you some examples of that. Indigenous folks with Tamanwit philosophy understand that space is an interrelated concept of cooperative ecologies and equitable living energies, and people are connected to a place. People don't own a place. This is very different. With colonial history comes concepts of property, where people literally can own a place. They don't see themselves anymore as interconnected to all the relations of that place. And instead, they see the natural world in terms of resources for extraction. And out of this is the naturalization of capitalist mentality, commodification, pyramid schemes, monetized values, including living things. So things like the enslavement of people could be accomplished when space is no longer an interrelated and cooperative ecological concept grounded in the bioregion of where people are living. Tamanwit, this natural law, and you can, so like if you go around the United States and in fact to indigenous communities throughout the world, there are different place-based communities who understood those principles. And examples of this is you can find the first foods of most peoples throughout the world. Those foods came from those bioregions. They were cared for by the people of those places, and they had a meaning, an interconnection. But with colonization, and I'm speaking mostly in the United States, came this sociopathy of a racist white heteropatriarchy, a dehumanization and othering of the indigenous people who were there, and very quickly a overwhelming overpopulation, where there was a shift from a village scale society to a city, and the carrying capacity of the bioregions were thrown out the door. In the United States, especially with westward expansionism, we just see like an extraction of resources from the very beginning that overwhelmed indigenous peoples of those places and reinterpreted them. And the reinterpretation happens in a very literal way. We can see place-based naming, where indigenous people would name the rivers, the mountains, the valleys, that in ways that explained what those places meant. And instead, with colonization of the Americas, we see a renaming, a controlling of the nomenclature and the narrative around place. Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to talk about Portland, Oregon. So welcome to Portland, Oregon. And I love being in Portland. Like, there's so many photogenic moments you can experience in Portland, in spite of its being a relatively large city. And I'm not from Portland, Oregon. I've been living here about 25 years. And I think it behooves me to be accountable to the place that I'm living. And, this is, I mentioned, like, I'm pedagogically, I use this a lot in my classes where I'm empowering students to consider where they come from and how they have arrived at Portland State University, and to consider, like, well, who was here before we were all here? And what are the implications of this new landscape that we all have learned to love? How can we be accountable for being here? And what is the history of this place? Part of this nomenclature I mentioned, you go across the state of Oregon, and most of the place names have been renamed. And these are names that don't have any meaning. Right down to Portland, Oregon, there was a competition between a couple of the so-called founding fathers of Portland who flipped a coin. One of them wanted the name Portland, the other wanted the name Boston, and Portland won. Wait, was it Boston? I can't even remember. I try to distance myself from a lot of these colonial narratives, but Portland won the coin flip. And the whole idea that you're going to name a place based on the flip of a coin, and this colonial strategy of naming places with the same names, like, it's just a basic lack of creativity too, that I would critique all of these place names that we can see in multiple states and in our cities too. And it's by design. Like, this is a colonial strategy and a nomenclature to create a narrative around that place. And that is a narrative of control. Portland being located between the confluence of the Willamette River and the Columbia River. We're right here. And there are a couple sites that I'm going to focus in on, sacred sites in this region. One is called Celilo Falls, which is up here. And the other one is called Willamette Falls, which is down here. And these really are focal points. These are sacred places in the past, and they're also sacred places in the present. We could probably do this analysis in Eastern Northern Europe around Lithuania. This is an old map of Lithuania. And I mentioned, like, I'm not from Portland. My ancestors are actually from around here. Oops, sorry, I jumped the gun there. My ancestors are from around Radom, Poland, and what's today Lviv in the Ukraine. And we've become, after World War II, being Jewish people originally from Spain, we ended up being refugees from these places. And I've been fascinated to look at maps of Europe. And there's a great one that I've seen where you can see how the boundaries shift. Like, you go from the 1200s up to the present day, and boy, are those boundaries changing at a whim, place names changing. That's a characteristic I think we see in a lot of places that have been colonized. So back to Portland, Oregon. And anyone know who this is? Victor, do you know this person?
Let me unmute. Of course, everybody in Lithuania knows who he is.
I imagine so. Yeah. I'm not a big basketball fan, but apparently Portland Blazers does have a Lithuanian player on their team. So I just thought I would put that in there to keep people awake. So land acknowledgements. This is a place that I go to every year. I first went there in 1998. This is up on Mount Hood, about an hour and a half from my house. And then I've got to hike in about 8 miles to get here. And I love this place. This is an amazing place. I drink water from that river. and I look up at the majesty of this mountain and just this feeling of this alpine timberline. And it connects me in a way that I really can't describe. So I made a promise in 1998 to always return to this place. And I've done that every single year. And I think by way of land acknowledgement, I'm connecting myself to this place. And I drink the water from this stream and I celebrate it. And that place then becomes a part of myself, as much as it can for a refugee, the son of refugees, a first generation born in the United States, US American. There are limitations to my ability to connect to a place and be indigenous to that place. I'm reminded in my work with the corn and tortillas, we will source corn from places in Mexico, directly from the milpas of small plot farmers. And I've heard interviews with them where they talk about how important the particular corn is to them, not only for the ancestral knowledge that it's been passed down over the generations. So as they plant the corn, they can appreciate their ancestors in providing this, this great food innovation. But then also that sustains them, that they eat every day. But also they consider that after they die, the ancestors are buried in the ground and their bodies literally become a part of the earth. And that earth fertilizes the corn that they grow and eat. So they're also sustained by their ancestors in that way. That's some deep shit. That's like some beautiful concept. That blows me away to consider that kind of connection to place. And as a refugee of diasporic people, I don't know if I will ever have that experience. So the closest I can do is pay attention to the earth and go to places like this place on Mount Hood and do the best I can to connect to a place that I am not native to. Land acknowledgements have become more popular, and I think Portland and Oregon are really promoting these before events, before classes, before celebrations. There'll be an acknowledgement of the land on which we are standing. And I'm here right now in Portland, and quite typically we will acknowledge the different peoples, because there are a lot of different peoples in this bioregion, the Multnomah, the Clackamas and Chinookan speaking people of the Big River, the Yakima, although they're in Washington State, they're still part of our bioregion and continue to be, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and all the descendants of the 9 federally recognized tribes and confederations in the state of Oregon. It's a complex picture, and there were no big cities. There was no state-level society in Oregon until colonization. What we see is a series of like smaller nucleated villages, and these people are speaking different languages. They're engaging in trade. The folks along the river, there's a lot of salmon people. There's gathering of wapato and a bulb called camas, deer hunting, foraging for huckleberries. There really was a huge diversity of plant and animal species. And there's a huge diversity of people who could find their places on these multiple bioregional ecologies and survive for thousands of years. Archaeologically speaking, there's no evidence of warfare. There's no fortified cities, you know, all the things that you see as a component of a competitive state-level society, hierarchies, patriarchies. Like we can't read that in the archaeological landscape in the past, nor in the present. These are matrilineal societies, agricultural, gathering, foraging peoples who lived in respect to the carrying capacity of their bioregion, which is to say they didn't overpopulate so that they destroyed all of the so-called resources of their bioregion. And the ways they did that, I always talk about this in my classes when we're focusing on the Caribbean, like how did they understand not to overpopulate? And it must be due in at least some part to women's understandings and control of their own bodies. That's how you don't overpopulate. You can make the case that they were suffering from all these diseases and life was short, but the archaeological record does not substantiate that. Here's some of the different language groups that are found in the state of Oregon around Portland. So again, Portland is around here. Chinookan-speaking people, Kalapuyan-speaking people, Molalla. My great hero, Franz Boas, was one of the anthropologists who was studying some of the linguistic affinities in the state of Oregon and then up into Washington state, and came up with some of those definitions. On top of different language groups, we can just look at place names. And some of these place names for villages that are here, we are at the confluence of the Columbia River and the Willamette. These are place names for villages, and maybe were or were not multiple ethnicities or tribes or communities of people. So it's a complex picture, the indigenous pre-Columbian Portland had. But certainly important were those two sites that I'll talk about in a second on the Willamette Falls and the Cascades of Celilo Falls. Bureau of Indian Affairs reservations, I'll make a mention of it, that during colonization, indigenous people suffered in a number of ways. There was violence done against them, disease, smallpox, influenza. These things really took a huge toll on indigenous lifeways, and outright stealing of their land and being forced, in many cases with these Trail of Tears, being forced to march off of their land onto a confederated tribal reservation. And this is a map of Portland that points out these reservations. Closest to Portland are Warm Springs and Grand Ronde. That's not to say that indigenous people also didn't try to survive in the cities. There's a lot of off-reservation indigenous populations in the past as well as in the present. This is Celilo Falls. This is an incredible sacred site for indigenous people. It has, I think, close to the same water volume as Niagara Falls, and it's in the Columbia River. So it's at this outcrop of exposed basalt. And what you see here are indigenous fishers. They are doing dip netting to catch salmon. Salmon there's a number of different species, and they will, really amazing fish. They will spawn in tributaries in fresh water, and then they will, when they're mature, they swim out to the ocean, and they live out in the ocean. And then when it's their time to return to spawn again, they'll go back to the freshwater and swim all the way upriver, crossing over waterfalls and anything in their way to get back to their place of origin. It's a beautiful homecoming story. The salmon teach people about who they are, and the people who ate the salmon really considered themselves interconnected with the salmon, which is typical. It's this tamanwit. Like, if you pay attention to the living things in the place you live, you will see how you are interconnected with them. So this was in a super incredible place, Celilo Falls. And there's another place I want to point out, similar, also with this basaltic outcrops. And that has to do with the geological history of only about 12,000 years ago. If anyone's interested in the Missoula floods, this is another thing that makes Portland a very special place. But these great flooding events, and this one that was only 12,000 years ago, which is relatively recent in geological times, created all these waterfalls. And this is another one in the Willamette Valley. And this happened because of this huge flooding incident where a lake the size of Lake Superior flooded, drained. It was like a glacial lake. And as the glacier receded, the ice dams broke, and a lake the size of Lake Superior flooded this whole region, scouring it and exposing these waterfalls. It's really amazing. And it's part of the understanding, the origin stories of the indigenous people of this bioregion. This is Willamette Falls. And, to see these fish swim back, and apparently, like, the fish are not as big as they used to be. They're not swimming as far back to the tributaries because a lot of these rivers got dammed. So that prevents, even though they have fish ladders and they'll even take fish, put them on barges to get them upriver, the fish populations are nothing like they used to be. And there's some descriptions of, there's so many fish in the river, you could walk across the river on the backs of the fish. That's how rich these areas were. So Celilo Falls was one, Willamette Falls is the other. Willamette Falls also has eels. These are lamprey, which are another species that actually goes out to the ocean and returns. So it's another important cultural foodway, first foods of the peoples of this bioregion. And this is another view of this Willamette Falls. Also a huge amount of water, similar to Niagara Falls, that spills over these falls. Quite a sight. So the indigenous history is cut short in the sense that the trajectory of indigenous lifeways is hugely impacted by colonization. And colonization is relatively recent. If you consider that Lewis and Clark, York, and Sacagawea arrive in the early 1800s, that's relatively short time ago by all historical definitions. So they came overland. This was their great contribution. And I can speak more, I'll talk more about York because these have become founding figures in the narrative of Oregon history. They came as explorers, but they were on land that was already explored. The descriptions of these explorations, the colonial narratives are presented through the work of Lewis and Clark, and they very much opened the door first to fur trading and then to outright manifest destiny westward expansionism. When we consider them as heroes, we have to be very careful to think about who we are, whose story we are being told. Shortly after Lewis and Clark, we see the British involved in the Hudson Bay Company. So this is in Fort Vancouver, right over the Columbia River in today's Washington state. And Fort Vancouver was set up as a place for fur traders to bring their goods. So the first resource that was exploited was literally beaver pelts. And this is for European hat making. And it was a huge industry. And Fort Vancouver became one of these first colonial capitalist endeavors to exploit the resources of the indigenous Pacific Northwest. During this time, with the introduction of European people, came the introduction of diseases, smallpox, yellow fever, influenza. All these things really impacted indigenous peoples in very tragic ways. People did survive as well, especially those who could remain on the margins of colonial society. Many indigenous people traded with these new arrivals of European descent. And there were also Kanaka villagers from Hawaii. So there's a whole sea trade going on in the Pacific side, and that would bring in even Afro-descent seamen. So during a time of slavery, there were opportunities for some pioneering Afro-descent people to come to Oregon and make their fortune or simply survive. And for a while in the early 1800s, there was a multi-ethnic frontier Oregon that existed. And cities were founded, and there was it's a chapter of history that isn't really written a lot about, but it is a compelling place as we consider what happened next, which was literally this Oregon Trail. And the Oregon Trail opened up the West through the land. And soon after, the railroads came, and then there was a huge population explosion. So this is the arrival of the space aliens. These are people who had no concern for the indigenous landscape, for the indigenous people. And we see throughout the West, the destruction of native foodways, like the killing of the buffalo, fencing in land, of course, disease, and just the overburdening of the landscape by too many people, and the literal violence of the taking of land, scalping, being rewarded monies for killing the indigenous people of these places. This is part of that westward expansion. And if you watch cowboy movies, I don't know what you get out in Lithuania, but we're told a completely different narrative of cowboys and Indians, or we get the other side of it, kind of more of a dancing with wolves, the noble savage meme or trope. But there's no doubt that this action of the Oregon Trail really fueled the shift away from indigenous societies. And part of the motivation was the United States declared this a territory and created mechanisms for people to travel west, and they would receive, if you were a married couple, through donation at Land Act and the Organic Act, 640 acres of free land. And it's all you had to do was live on the land and cultivate it for 4 years. 640 acres is a lot of space. And of course, there are only certain people, white men were the only ones who could apply for these government subsidies. So the US government created this manifest destiny policy simply out of the desire to take this land and with the narrative of taming it from the savagery that existed. And that happened with the dehumanization of the indigenous people and the inability to see these indigenous landscapes. And if you think about 640 acres, if you can access that kind of land, and this is great farmland. The Willamette Valley is highly productive. You can convince other people in a pyramid scam to come and buy 10 of your acres. And then they can convince some of their friends to get another 10 acres. And these sorts of real estate valuing, the commodification of land, really has driven the wealth in Oregon. And it's driven it in a way that is, it's not an equitable distribution, because only white people, only white men could profit from this free land grab. Written in both to the territory and then into the Constitution of the state of Oregon. And this is happening right before the Civil War, when states were declaring whether they were a free state or a slave state. And Oregon decided that it would become neither. It would simply not have slavery, and even further, it would not have Black people. Afro-descent people were not permitted to enter the state of Oregon. They would have no legal standing in a court of law, and they would be punished with some other laws called the Lash Laws, where they would be publicly whipped if they remained in the state of Oregon. This is called a white utopia, and it was framed by a lot of these early pioneers coming over in their wagons to exclude Afro-descent and people of color, and certainly indigenous people. This is the founding document of the incorporation of the state of Oregon. It did not take long for this region to go beyond its carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, which is the number of people who can live in a place without destroying the resources of that place. This was understood as the tamanwit of indigenous people. Sometimes the Iroquois had a concept of a 7-generation principle, that you make your decisions thinking 7 generations into the future. This was not in the consciousness of Euro-descent people who were commodifying the land and creating these cities, laying out an urban grid in order to auction off this land and just continue to build their wealth base. And that's very much true to the day. Real estate in Portland, like, good luck trying to buy a house. Prices are far exceed any kind of ability of people working a living wage job to afford. And banks take advantage of this. Everyone takes advantage of this until a real estate bubble pops, and then it rebuilds itself. This is all one big pyramid scam. The idea is that you can buy something and then sell it to someone else for more money than what you bought it for. That's what the stock market is. And that's what these cryptocurrencies are too. Beware of the cryptocurrencies. You know, the market could just bottom out at any time. For rich people, it doesn't matter because they have such capital behind them. They can diversify their ownings and they can take a loss on their taxes. This is how capitalism works. It works to the benefit of the rich and against the working class. And that's what we saw in the development of the city of Portland. A lot of this was fueled early on by the timber industry, and it continues to be fueled by the timber industry. Timber industry doesn't see the forest for the trees. It's all about resource extraction to make lumber. And there is no regard for the flora and fauna of these landscapes. And to this day, we continue to see a lot of activism against the degradation of our environment, clear-cutting practices. As much as I enjoy walking in the landscape near Mount Hood, a pristine landscape where I can drink the water, I also remind myself to walk in these landscapes that are denuded of their trees and their forests, and remember that this is not the answer to our problems. This is actually the source of our problems. So if you look at a GPS and you see like the degradation of our forests, we have less than 1% of original original old growth forests in the state of Oregon. And yet people still continue to think of us as this place for this rich environment. So meanwhile, literally with the timber industry, there's a unionizing activity. And I think this has always been present in people who are looking for opportunities to create unions, to create activism. And in Oregon, we had one of the largest rise of the KKK and anti-union activities. This is a picture of one of the mayors of Portland welcoming members of the Ku Klux Klan. I think membership, and the Ku Klux Klan is also a pyramid scam where they have different hierarchies of power, and it's like Tupperware. Like you can get someone in your clan to then ask other people to join, and you get money for that. Victor, do you have a question?
Well, no, I just wanted to make a quick suggestion. If people have questions, you can send them to me because you might forget your question, but please just send me on chat your questions and Pedro will be able to see them later. That's it.
Thanks.
Sorry.
No, not at all. So just continuing with this history, and this is, just a brief overview, of course. Chinese Exclusion Act impacted Chinese people who are living in Portland and throughout Oregon, who are often working in the timber industry. And even, I think, famously in Portland, we're known for our cherries. And the Bing cherry, which was named after a Chinese laborer named Ah Bing, who apparently created this species of cherry. He was one of the unfortunate people who went back to China and then could not return to the United States. We're full of stories of exploitation of labor, especially of people of color. And we see this also for Mexican immigrants who have been in agriculture for over 100 years in the state of Oregon. And then more recently with World War II, Japanese internment camps. Japanese American people being, their land being taken from them, being rounded up and sent to internment camps. This is a processing camp in Multnomah County, the city of Portland. After World War II, there was kind of a Jim Crow South that happened in Portland, where there was concern because during World War II, there were more Afro-descent people who showed up in Portland to work in the shipping industry. And there was redlining practices and all kinds of practices to keep Afro-descent people from forming viable neighborhoods and just being successful Portlanders. And these signs would appear in the windows of stores. Like this is the 1950s. We cater to white trade only. Viable Afro-descent neighborhoods like Albina were victims of eminent domain, where whether it was the convention center, the widening of I-5, the creation of a hospital, all of these things displaced vibrant Afro-descent communities. And these are still in the memories of a lot of people in Portland today. Meanwhile, Celilo Falls, eminent domain, is such where the federal government decides that you really don't have an option because it's in the public interest to build a dam. And this dam flooded Celilo Falls completely. Celilo Falls is completely underwater. There were some promises made for the residents of Celilo to receive funding for housing. And that housing did not appear until just about 5 years ago. So even treaty rights were not honored. And guaranteed in the treaty rights was also access to fishing, historic traditional fishing spots like Celilo Falls. And the US government determined that, well, they still have access to it, even though the falls are underwater. Same thing happened in Willamette Falls in a different way, paper mills, hydroelectric. This is what Willamette Falls looked like and really continues to look like today. Meanwhile, Native people were forced onto reservations like Grand Ronde and Warm Springs. You know, these are historic pictures. And when I look at them, I'm like, wow, you know, they look, it's like the Wild West. It looks like, you know, these cowboys and Indians movies. And it literally is like, this is not so long ago that this has happened in the Pacific Northwest. So today in Portland, if you look at the kind of the racial demographics, Portland is known as the whitest large city in the United States. 70% perhaps people are defined racially as white. The important thing here I want you to see is American Indian is at less than 1% of the population. The overpopulation as a colonial strategy, that I think is the biggest tool in the colonists' toolbox is settlement. So settler colonization has led to this. And if you can imagine like how this is reflected in access to wealth, how is this reflected in access to power, you can imagine like white people are the predominant demographic. So you would imagine also that wealth and power, especially given this history, is still in the hands of white people. Portland is like still a very beautiful city that has done a lot of very progressive innovations. One example here, there used to be a freeway going along the river, and we decided to take up that freeway and plant a bunch of trees and call it a park. That's a very Portland concept. We created Pioneer Courthouse Square. Instead of another parking garage, it was decided that a public place would be the heart of, or the living room of Portland was necessary. And this is it's a place to go to, but it's not like there's an Eiffel Tower or a Space Needle. The brilliance of this project in the very heart of Portland is that the people are the Eiffel Tower and the Space Needle. I think there's like this longing for community. I'm not exactly sure the psychology of it, but it certainly is a real part of being in Portland today. And then in our neighborhoods, there is this pedestrian food and drink culture. And Portland is very much known for that livability. Transportation, encouraging bicycles. We've got a light rail system. And we are bicycleable. Like we do have a little bit of snow, but you can pretty much be a bicycle commuter throughout the year. And although we have challenges with homelessness and with the challenges of wealth disparities, we're also looking at solutions to those problems. How can we create homeless villages and rest stops? And I think Portland is really pushing the envelope on that. Portland's always been known as a protest city. George Dad Bush called it Little Beirut. People in Portland get together and change things. And I think even like the racism that we saw in the 50s was met with an activism to change the public accommodation laws. So I think Portlanders are able to take to the streets or feel empowered to take to the streets. And so during the Black Lives Matter social justice, racial justice movement, people took to the streets in unprecedented ways. I think we were in the streets for months. Other cities would come out for a few days, and we came out night after night after night. And we came out in different ways, some in more educational ways, some with theaters of protest, some with rage. And sometimes these did devolve or evolve into property destruction. But at the heart, there is a knowledge that this is, it's about making our city a place for everyone, or at least I would like to believe that. I don't believe everyone in the crowd shares the same ideology of why they're there, but I think there is a general consciousness around that. And then we get a reaction to the reaction. So Portland is also known for these skirmishes between white supremacists and Antifa. And then just on our progressive city council level, whether it's the Guardian or Donald Trump, like there were some vociferous condemnations of Portland's leadership. And in general, there is a highly progressive leadership in Portland. And I think they're doing what they can given the weight of Portland's history. So there's a lot to take on. And in the very least, Portland City Council has created a number of efforts to address things like income, wealth disparities, and indigeneity. So you better believe they have a land acknowledgement that they read before they conduct their business. There's been a lot of partnerships and collaborations with green spaces and parks and indigenous communities. Land proclamations, programs for indigenous youth, leadership in parks, Indigenous Persons Day, naming our latest bridge after Tillicum, the meeting. So we have a new bridge, and changing names in high schools, as well as land trusts and housing loans for historically displaced communities. So our city government is kind of a reflection of this consciousness that exists. Good news that Celilo did get some of that housing that it was promised 50 years ago. And Celilo Village, I would say, is thriving. It's not, I don't know if I'd say thriving, it's surviving. But the good news is that, so this is a sonar of Celilo Falls. There was some concern that in the construction of the Dalles Dam, there were explosives used to destroy Celilo Falls. But in fact, those explosives did not hurt the falls. The falls are simply underwater. So there's a movement to save Celilo Falls and remove those dams. And it turns out that the dams, you can still generate hydroelectric power and have lower levels of water. It's only through barging that is the issue. This is a Yakima chairman who is pushing. This is Celilo Falls. He is standing at that site, that fishing site, the waterfalls of Celilo Falls. And I think there's like a movement towards removing those dams. In the state of Oregon, we've removed a number of dams, and we'll see what next generations do. There's a movement also, traditional fishing and eel catching is happening at Willamette Falls. This is something guaranteed to the indigenous people, and they now have access to it. Not only do they have access, but because they have a casino up on Grand Ronde, they've been able to fund buying back a significant portion of Willamette Falls, both for their cultural access, but also to create, this is the model for a marketplace, which would be its traditional function. the falls were places where people would gather and exchange as well as fish, because the fish was kind of the source of a lot of the trade. So this is an image for Oregon City, where Willamette Falls is, to create access for everyone, but also to have special access for indigenous people to do their traditional fishing and lamprey collection. This is William Spoonmaker, who is a colleague of mine. He sells fish at the Portland Farmers Market. And honoring those treaty rights means really providing access in a way that needs more attention. There's a whole commercial fishing industry on the Columbia River, and this is another area that needs reform. So how can I encapsulate a lot of these, the history of Portland, thinking about space aliens, and as I time travel from the past and come into the present, it seems to me that a lot of these monuments of the narrative that we have been taught, that kids learn in schools from an early age about the Oregon Trail, that are on all the signposts in the city of Portland, all of these founding fathers, like Harvey Scott, who has a statue to him on Mount Tabor. He also has some other things named after him. Considering how the nomenclature of colonization, these become sites of contention. So in the same way that I noticed Columbus was being questioned during the quincentennial, so too are some of these colonial narratives being contended with in Portland, Oregon. So that statue has been vandalized or added to over the years, painting the Harvey Scott. Harvey Scott, well, not only did he come over on the Oregon Trail, he was against women's suffrage, and he was a newspaper editor. So he was very much promoting that narrative through his lifetime. And then he's rewarded with the acknowledgements on monuments and namings of places. It was only a matter of time before Harvey Scott came down. And during the Black Lives Matter racial justice protests in Portland, a whole bunch of people came down. I never thought it was possible to see even Abraham Lincoln. You'll notice Dakota 38. This is a reference to the hanging of 38 indigenous people during these fabricated Indian wars. So when you have colonization and indigenous people fight back for their homeland, it's reframed into a narrative of a war, as if Dakota people are at war with the United States. It's the United States that's colonizing their land. So taking down even someone like Abraham Lincoln is a fair critique. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, great imperialist. You'll notice stolen land. There's very often indigenous messaging around these political actions. How about Thomas Jefferson? This is at Jefferson High School. And there's a whole movement to rename the high schools. At some point in US American history, high schools and street names around main streets, they all got the names of early presidents, these kind of founding fathers. And that's really being questioned. As we think about ourselves in community, how inspiring are these people? And do we really want to have them be the ones honored by whether it's a street sign or a monument? So slave owning, a child molester, Thomas Jefferson. He's a child molester because he had a child with a 15-year-old who was enslaved by him. So it's a whole complicated story that would not have any form of consent. So that's how I feel comfortable calling Thomas Jefferson a child molester as well as a slave owner. How about George Washington, also a slave owner? All of these are in Portland, Oregon. Meanwhile, after the statue of Harvey Scott came down in Mount Tabor, overnight, a mysterious, uncommissioned piece of artwork appeared, and it was to honor York. So if you remember back to the Lewis and Clark expedition, York was the Afro-descent enslaved person of William Clark. And there's a lot of stories in the journals of Lewis and Clark about how much York did to contribute to this expedition. And he even was able to use a gun, which was not that common for enslaved people of the time. So he was a good shot. He had a lot of knowledge. He knew how to get along with people. And a lot of indigenous people, their references to how they would look to York. He was a big man, strong man, and they would engage in social interactions with York. A great asset to the Lewis and Clark voyage was York. And the thought was, after this great amount of work and life risking, York would be freed by William Clark. But it turns out he wasn't. William Clark decided not to free him, not to let him live with his enslaved wife, and instead he remained enslaved for most of the rest of his life, except until the very end. We don't know a lot about York, and we don't know about York from his perspective. And I wish I had given you the copy of the plaque. The plaque is just focusing on York as a component and as a different figure to focus on as a founding father for the history of Oregon. And it's, I think, the juxtaposition or the substitution of Harvey Scott for York is compelling. It's not compelling for everyone. And there were a number of vandalisms that happened, some by some people who just were not of right mind, and others by people who were white supremacists and suffered from a sociopathy. But then there were other statements made whereby, instead of simply celebrating York, creating a more complex critique. So his blood is on your hands, because York came as part of a whole colonial movement, and still celebrating York, you know, it's a good question. Who is York in terms of a person who is on top of a statue? Ultimately, it was brought down too. It was attributed to a group called Patriot Front, a white supremacist, sociopathic group. And for a while, there was nothing up on the pedestal. This has encouraged a lot of conversation. And my colleague, Dr. Daryl Milner, was part of one of these conversations about public art. And this whole idea of what do we want to celebrate? I think this is, instead of having a knee-jerk reaction in the city of Portland, like we need to put those statues back, those statues are going into storage, and people are thinking deeply about commemoration and the narratives that we are telling ourselves about the city of Portland. York's statue, the pedestal, has become kind of a place of pilgrimage, and there's a lot of messaging that's happening to this day. And most recently, we got this, another uncommissioned work of art that also has a statement that's pretty much like, let's figure this one out, Portland. Who do we want to commemorate? And that's like a crow giving us the finger. So I've shown you a whole bunch of images of Portland as sort of an idyllic place to live, a place to call home, but with this disconnect. If we take the time to time travel and understand and be accountable to the history of place. I've introduced you to some of these concepts: Tamanwit, natural law, thinking from indigenous perspectives. And I hope that's something that is useful in your consideration of place. But ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, like, well, how do we time travel then into the future? Which is a lot of the work that is happening. I think people always, you have to have a vision, you have to have a dream, or you can't manifest the reality that you would like. And I think only by being accountable to the past can we start to have those conversations and then imagine the kind of city that we want to live in, the community that we want to live in and the world that we want to live in. So I think at that, I'm going to say thank you for being patient and hearing my stories of Portland. And I'll just stop sharing and open up to any questions or comments.
Well, thank you very much for that totally fascinating talk. I'm sure from a Lithuanian point of view, which I don't know as well as I should, there were a lot of resonances, especially since statues are also being taken down here and have been taken down. So there's a long conversation that we can have on that, I think, with our Lithuanian audience. But you have 3 questions. Can you read them on the chat? I can read them for you if you can't see.
Yeah, I can't, I don't see them.
Okay. It says, hey, I'm not sure if you are watching Facebook too, but we have a question there. What are your takes on the recent racial problems in the USA? Quote, parentheses, Black Lives Matter, the Asian hate. Where do they originate from? There's a bunch of questions after that, but let's stop on that one and then I'll read you the other ones later.
Yeah, can you tell where that person is from by the?
Lithuanian.
They're from Lithuania. Yeah, it's a legitimate question. And, we're all part of world history, but we tend to insulate ourselves through our national boundaries as if it doesn't matter to us, as if we haven't benefited if it hasn't been directly related. Like in Lithuania, I don't think you necessarily enslaved Afro descent people as part of a national policy to grow cotton crops. Like that's a story of the United States. But I think there's certainly plenty of examples of injustice and dehumanization of people at the benefit of, a wealthier elite is usually the story. Like there are kingdoms in Lithuania. In the United States, we don't have kingdoms, but we have a wealthy elite that has pretty much promoted and been supported by a middle class or to dehumanize certain people and scapegoat them as either not humans or as being from some other country. And that is what I refer to as the sociopathy of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. And I don't think the United States is the only place that has had that happen. That's happened worldwide. It just manifests itself a little differently. There are different winners and losers. And, but the thing that we all have in common is that the earth itself, the places we call home, have been impacted by the ways that we choose to include or exclude other people. If you want to learn more about racial injustice in the United States, there's I can encourage you to, there's a lot of different takes on it. And I think it's best to go to my colleagues in Black Studies, people of Afro descent who study more specifically the history of and the contemporary realities of anti-Black racism. And because on one end you can say, well, things have gotten better, but there's still a very prevalent anti-Black racism that exists in the United States. And I think will continue to exist as long as we follow the narrative that we've created for ourselves around our national identity.
Well said. There's a couple sets of other questions, but I think you answered them here. Let me go to the last part of this question, because even though we can see some similar events in other countries, this seems to be concentrated on the USA. I think you answered that by saying this is a world matter. And then there's a question on the crow. Why does it give a finger, and to whom?
I'm going to have to give you the citation. I wish I had included that plaque. There's a reference to an artist I mean, it's also art. So I think the gist of the plaque is that Portlanders need to get their shit together and think about who they want to commemorate and then do that. And it's like a kind of a call for a public process. There is a reference to an artist who I don't recognize. I think it's like a 19th century artist. I don't know if it's a reference to the style of the crow, but I think in general that crow is not going to stay up there much longer. I think the crow is it's a kind of a devil's advocate piece. That's how I read that. I don't see it as a substantive response, but I'll be glad to find a resource so that you can look at the statue with its plaque and make your interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Augie? Eva?
I would have some.
Okay.
May I? My question would be, you mentioned pedagogy. I wanted to ask American kids at school, how much do they learn about pre-colonial history, pre-Columbian history? We see that at university, people do learn these things, but what about schools?
Yeah, we are now in the state of Oregon. There is a new mandate for ethnic studies. And, but in general, it's like when we study history, it's like very little. There's like an acknowledgement of indigenous people, but it's not put into this accountable narrative. You have to go to college and take a class, maybe in indigenous nation studies, to really get that accountable narrative. And I think that's, it's better than it used to be. Like when I was a kid going to school, watching cowboy and Indian movies. Do you get to watch those in Lithuania?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I am. So that's, we were taught that it was okay to play cowboys and Indians. That's part of our national identity. And that's the white supremacist, sociopathic national identity that we're taught. So we still have a long way to go. And there has been some movement forward, but in general, there's still a long way to go. Can I turn the question around? I don't know much about, and I looked up Lithuania. I read because I was going to travel there. So I did look up a book on the history of Lithuania. But from my travels to a place, like I did some study abroad in Spain, and I was shocked at the national history that was being presented in public places and monuments with an absolutely lack of accountability to the extraction of wealth from the Americas that built these beautiful European cities like Barcelona. And there was like, there'd be like little references to the Indianos, like these are Spanish people who like made their fortune in the Americas. And it's like, what are we talking about here? We're talking about people who encourage the enslavement of others, who encouraged violence upon indigenous folks, who extracted their resources, the gold and the silver. And you can build a bridge from the silver that was extracted. I think that was a go. In Bolivia, there's a silver mine. And I think they can say from the number of years that people worked those mines, indigenous enslaved people, you could take their bodies and build a bridge from Bolivia to Spain. It's like there's no accountability. Catholic Church, no accountability. So I guess my question is, Lithuania seems to have a lot of like, so many changing hands from Prussia to Poland to these kingdoms. What kind of history is taught in Lithuania when it comes to indigeneity? Like who is indigenous in Lithuania? And who gets to really claim that the primacy of being from that place?
It's a really big question. That's all I have to say right now. But come on, somebody answer this question. I know Augie knows this history backwards and forwards, and so does Christine and probably Rata.
Yeah, well, I think we have different issues. We have issues with our relations with Jews, actually, in Lithuania. So it's a part of our culture, actually, and there were huge diasporas, inhabitants in Vilnius, in Kaunas, and they just disappeared. So it's more about these minorities, I think, ethnic Roma people nowadays. So I think we feel indigenous and not in our place.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that indigenous people are anybody who does not have an ethnic origin from outside of Lithuania. Even though you may be Prussian and Polish and Hungarian, you're all Lithuanian as long as you're not Jewish, or I imagine Muslim, or perhaps Afro descent. Like, those things do not make you nationally Lithuanian.
Yeah, it's more about nationalism. I think it's our building of our identities in the way of nationalism, and so those we're thinking about those Jews now nowadays as a part of our tradition as well. But so they were killed and taken away during the Second World War, and Lithuanians participated in that. So it's, if we can compare those things, maybe something comparable in the attitude with indigenous in the US.
But in a way, I don't know Lithuanian history very well, but so other people can add, but in a way, Lithuanians could have been seen as, 40%, I think, of Lithuanians have been deported to camps in Russia, to Siberia. So in a way, Lithuanian white people never really had the sense of, they have a sense of having been the slaves of larger groups of Russians, and this has been kind of the battleground for many different groups of people, where Lithuanians are kind of at the center of being at this battleground. And also I don't think, though it's an interesting question, but extracting wealth from other places and other people, I don't think Lithuania has a history, or even a hidden history of, maybe it has a hidden history of that, but I don't know. I don't think so.
As I said, it's a matter of nationalism, and nationalism is using such narratives as victimization. We like to think as we were victims, not, for example, we were more victims than Jews, maybe, in Lithuania. And by the way, talking about cowboys movies, in the Soviet Union, there were, it was a lot movies made about Indians as protagonists and cowboys as the bad guys. And it was a very famous actor, Goyko Mitic, in DDR. He was playing protagonist Indian, and it was very popular. So I was raised on movies where Indians were kind of fighting for their freedom, and I think it was it was made on purpose to make comparison with working class with proletarian movement.
That's really interesting. I think I'm reminded by like the power of nationalism to convince people of a group inclusion, and therefore, as you say, the othering of people who are not part of their concept of national identity. And if there's a way into the future, this is my time travel into the future, this Tamanwit concept of being a place-based community, then we are in relation to all of our living things in a place. Therefore, the idea of like, there aren't other people from other places. We are identifying ourselves in our place. And I'd love to think that that is part of what's happening in Portland, but we have too many people. It's going to be very difficult because we are overusing the natural resources. And that means that we won't be able to practice our indigenous culture or our place-based culture. But if we can spread out more and decrease our population, maybe then we would have the ability to create community in respect to the earth, and we wouldn't have to think about othering other communities. Do you ever do nationalism? Like you're all anthropologists. Like I remember Benedict Anderson and Imagined Communities, and just thinking about that, I think that ties into the concepts of nationalism that I work with. And I wish there was a way to deconstruct nationalism. I wish there was a way that we can undo all of the damage, all of the violence that has been caused by nationalist interests. So I've got to imagine it. You know, if we can't dream it, we aren't going to be able to manifest it. So I'm going with that piece of indigenous knowledge, that take inspiration from place so that we can imagine the world that we want to live in. That's an indigenous principle.
Let's go.
Hi, everyone. I can give a short comment, or at least try to join the discussion a little bit about this rhetoric of indigenous peoples, right? So I think, especially the young people right now in Lithuania, they are mostly searching for their roots, not in this nationalist sentiment, which has been built up through our kings, Mindaugas, King Mindaugas, and all of these grand dukes, right? And all of these sort of warring sort of warriors and knights and all of this. So this part of our history, we mostly use now for building our nationalist sentiment. But a lot of the young people, they are looking towards an even older history, and maybe this is what can bring us to some sort of indigenous status also. Gimbutiene, Maria Gimbutiene, she wrote so much about all kinds of old Baltic mythology and our Baltic sort of history. So I think if we want to trace our roots as indigenous peoples of this land, so maybe we can try to trace them from this sort of rhetoric of Gimbutiene, which also she mentioned some similar things of which you had mentioned, talking about the Indians, this matrilineal sort of way of building a community where the mother is most important. So again, maybe looking into the future, we can try to look back first at this matrilineal sort of conception for constructing our identity, right? That's my sort of comment. Yeah.
I love that. Is Maria Gimbutas Lithuanian?
Gimbutas, yeah, she is.
I didn't know that. I wasn't paying attention to that. I love her work. I've been greatly inspired by her work. And I think you're right. I think there's a piece of the critique of white supremacist heteropatriarchy that has heteropatriarchy in it. And I think that we have to dismantle patriarchy, and we have to allow for women and queer voices to be centered. That's got to be a starting point. And maybe it's possible. I wish Lithuania luck. You know, I look at Spain and I think, you know, like there are all these different regions that have their different languages. But the problem is when they go toward independence, they're still run by a nationalist, patriarchal leaders. And that prevents the kind of dream that I would have of a more equitable place-based society, because it just turns into another power play. But I think that's totally where, those are your indigenous roots. Like I think Maria Gamboutas's analyses, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, like that, archaeologically speaking, you see place-based societies that are equitable, they're non-hierarchical, and they're matrilineal, presumably run by women. I would love to think that there is a future like that for these nation states in Eastern and Central Europe.
I sort of disagree with a lot of what you're saying, actually, but I don't want to rain on a parade, and I'm not sure if I can. It does remind me of Michela de Leonardo's statement that, you know, women are just like men. They're capable of being angels and they're capable of being demons. I don't think if you dismantle patriarchy that suddenly you get a magical world where people are good, or if you get a matriarchy that things get more equitable. I think you have to dismantle capitalism, maybe. Capitalism doesn't have a gender or a sexual orientation.
I mean, actually, it does. Capitalism exists along
with. Well,
with.
it does now, but it doesn't in itself have that kind of thing.
I would contend with a study of, so I'm talking like a worldwide study, pre-colonial cultures. So the indigenous cultures around the world, before they reach any level of state level societies, that's where you start seeing the hierarchies. That's where you start seeing the patriarchies. That's where you see the warfares and the classisms and the racisms and the violence and the environmental degradation. Pre-colonial level societies, hunter-gatherer societies, chieftain level societies, do not have those characteristics. So I would push back on that, and I would tie together, I mean, because we're not talking about women and men, we're talking about systems.
Right.
So I'm pushing back, because that's my job as a student, right? Or is your job as a professor?
Well,
oh, it's like we're back in South Carolina.
No, we're not. It's but I don't think chiefdoms were such great places to be. I mean, if you look at Hawaiian chiefdoms, they were pretty goddamn awful. To people. I mean, the Hawaiian chief, if I remember my history on this, they were pretty terrible. They could kill anybody they wanted to whimsically, or torture them, which they did frequently, from what I read.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of knowledge of Hawaii, but I would even take those societies and look at them archaeologically and be like, they never constructed ships, went to someone else's land and declared war upon them, to the extent that colonial societies and state level societies, and that includes like Inca, Maya, like there's certainly indigenous peoples who practiced colonization and violence, but the degrees I think are dissimilar. And I don't support like Hawaiian chieftains fighting with each other, but I think it's just of a different scale. And the environmental degradation that comes with colonization is so much bigger than the Hawaiian situation that I don't think they're comparable. How about that?
Well, Pinker would disagree with you. Pinker has argued that, I mean, I'm not a Pinker fan, but I think it's much more complicated than all of that. Pinker argues that this last century, and he has lots of statistics to prove it, is the most peaceful, even if you include World War I and II, most peaceful century in the history of humankind. So there is evidence to suggest the opposite of what you're saying. I don't believe that argument, but his argument is a fairly strong one, and there have been counter arguments to it. This idea of hunters and gatherers all being kind of, there is a sense of equality. I think the basic problem is social and economic inequalities, and I think the structure of these systems where you get paid way more money for certain kinds of positions that are ascribed as opposed to achieved. Some are achieved, but they're still on the backs of ascribed statuses. I mean, I think that's the root of the problem, not, and that has to be resolved. Similarly in the US, where you have money is politics.
You know, I even have a colleague in the history department who's written an article called "The Case for Colonization," and he's making that same sort of argument. I don't know the person you're referring to, but we can do
Steve Pinker.
Yeah, we could quantify, you know, like what is quality of life for humans, but the Tamanwit principle is not human-centric. We're thinking about all of our relations. So I think like the colonization that we see in the violence of state-level society, it's really it's like space aliens. These are people who have forgotten what it means to live on the Earth.
I love your concept of space aliens. It's a very nice concept. On the other hand, let someone else talk. There must be other people here who have questions about this. Eva? Gabia? Urata?
I have one question, if I may. So you mentioned various social movements as Antifa, Proud Boys, Black Lives Matter. But I wonder, is there any Native American political activism, social and political activism in Portland, in Oregon? We don't get to hear much about it in general in Lithuania or in Europe.
Yeah, there is. You don't get to hear a lot of it in the United States. I think the United States, and whether it's the media, they don't tell these stories because it's owning up to a very violent history of space aliens. It's like opening a bag, like when you tear the statue down of George Washington, it's that really is asking like, well, then who are we? If we're not George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and cowboys and Indians, then who are we? And that creates a great uncomfortability amongst space aliens who have bought into a narrative. So yes, there's a lot, Native people have been fighting this whole time. They fight from their local jurisdictions. So they're on particular land, and there's a concept of sovereignty that indigenous people tend to have, where they are sovereign nations within this colonial settler state, and their principal point of action is there. But there are times when the actions of the colonizer are so egregious that they come together in political ways. Standing Rock is one of those examples. This is an example of a pipeline going through land in the Dakotas. And that there are a lot of different people there, but they came together as indigenous people. And they came from all over the United States and all over the world to support this particular action for the earth. Doesn't happen all the time. In Canada, there's also movement. And it seems to resurface like in pieces. In the urban environment, there's a land back movement. So a lot of it is increasing consciousness. Some of it is direct action. And other of it is just it's the long view that it's going to take a while, that the earth is old and we are in its inhabitants, but thinking out 7 generations, a lot of the strategizing is, it's not the kind of strategizing that you see in like Eurodescent, space alien culture. I'd say also like I don't know if this is anthropologically romantic, but I always think like doing the work of culture, the biskavayang of culture, making a basket is activism. Planting corn is activism. Catching salmon in an ancestral place, in an ancestral way, is activism. So a lot of the activism in a survival mode, in a settler colonial state, is the actions of every day that connects the past to the present. So the action of culture. And I think like, I wish anthropologists had more of a role in promoting that concept that culture is activism. And in that way, I think we can support the activism of indigenous people and recognize what their needs are and how we can respond to their needs, because they need to be centered in any conversation about what comes next. They're the ones who have been the stewards of this land in the United States. So their knowledge and their rights as a sovereign nation need to be respected. Thank you for the question. These are all really great questions.
Other questions? Well, it's late here in Lithuania. I would imagine this conversation could last a bit longer, but I think it's probably, does anybody have another a final question? Or it would be interesting to compare the tearing down like the Jalias Tiltas, the Green Bridge, where they have these statues of Russian military and heroes, I think, mostly, and they were torn down by the consent of the people. I think they had you can all correct me on this, but I think there was a vote on whether we should keep or whether Lithuanians should keep those statues. These wonderful green statues that were along this bridge, but that was heritage of the Soviet times. And they just tore down a bust of a well-known communist in a park here. So there's a lot of discussions here, and it would be interesting from an anthropological point of view to see how the narratives between here and in the US, how they're similar and how they're really quite different, I think. An intern could work on that very issue, Christina. Anyway, Yurata, anyone? Okay, so thanks a lot for this wonderful discussion. I learned a lot. I think it's a really wonderful idea to tie what's presently happening in Portland, where I suppose assumed there would be more kind of political kinds of answers and immediate answers, but to go back and to tie it into indigenous peoples of the time and to tie it into things that you would not ordinarily tie it in, I thought was a wonderful, for me, not that I agreed with everything you said, but it was wonderfully opened my mind to a different way of seeing what's going on now and how it has to be tied to the past, even if nobody, to past history, even if nobody considers that to be a necessary thing. It is a necessary thing. And you've convinced at least me and perhaps other people that this tying it back in the space alien things, which most of us are space aliens. I'm sure most of the people in Portland who are doing good things, as you said, are also space aliens to that extent. Most of them, not all of them. And if they are not space aliens, one wonders to what degree that becomes a conventionalized, politically correct thing rather than something that they really take to heart. I suppose it isn't so bad being a conventionalized figure of speech, better than no speech at all. But it's an interesting situation, and I think you enlightened a lot of us on this new way of thinking about the present.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure being projected into Lithuania.
Well, we'll see you here someday.
Yeah, and I'm around, you know, if anyone, like, I would love to have coffee. Anyone want to have coffee, especially you, Victor? Like, I'd love to, like, reminisce about our times and have these conversations. I think we run the risk of just being anthropologists talking about anthropology to other anthropologists, and getting out of our boxes and learning about other places and people and times. I think it, to me, like, I just love learning more. And that's what I love about you, the monk. It was like that curiosity that you always bring. You're always listening carefully and thinking clearly.
Yeah, I wish my wife thought the same thing. Okay, so good morning to you. We'll have coffee whenever you send me a message, or I might do it to you.
Okay,
and, we'll invite Christina and Raplis and Urata, and we can have a roundtable conversation without it being formalized.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.